By current estimates, there's about 17,000 people groups in the world today. In South Asia, the highest barriers are culture, caste, and religion. Elsewhere, language is the highest barrier to the spread of the gospel. These are the two main barriers. Understanding would be language. Acceptance would be ethnicity, religion, or culture. When defining a people group, the highest barrier must be determined, whether it's understanding or acceptance. And these include sometimes two or more of the following four factors: language, culture, religion, and geography. By current estimates, there's about 17,000 people groups in the world today. In South Asia, the highest barriers are culture, caste, and religion. Elsewhere, language is the highest barrier to the spread of the gospel. People groups defined by language are ethno-linguistic peoples, and people groups defined by culture, caste, or religion are ethno-cultural peoples. Cross-cultural evangelism is sharing the gospel with those of a different language, culture, religion. Voluntary going. Voluntary going is when believers actively travel to another land to proclaim God's blessing. Involuntary going is when believers are forced into another land or culture because of persecution, slavery, and then they influenced the new culture toward faith. Voluntary coming is when people voluntarily migrated into or invaded areas of believers and were influenced by the believer's faith. Involuntary coming is when people were forced to migrate into areas of believers and were influenced toward their believer's faith. One example of this involuntary coming would be most recently the refugees from Syria and the Middle East that flooded into Europe and areas where believers are much stronger than where they came from. Now, this is a bit of a complex, and I don't know if you're going to be able to see everything on here, but I do want to point out a couple of things. These first three are traditional churches in a Muslim setting. And so the Muslim people are going to look at these three churches, these traditional church or even this contextualized community. It says here, the features of Christ-centered communities using culture, both language and other forms which are foreign to local Muslim culture. So they're going to see this first one as obviously foreign and not want to participate in any way. The second one is a traditional church but using culture foreign to local Muslim culture but using a daily language. So they may be able to speak Arabic or Urdu, but yet there's still the trappings of all the culture things that seem foreign to them that they're not going to accept. And then finally in this section, the contextualized community, it says they're using local cultural forms but rejecting Islamic religious forms. And so these three here are in trouble of not being able to truly convey the gospel in a way that they would understand or accept. Now, as we move towards the C4, it says a contextualized community using local cultural forms and biblically acceptable Islamic forms. So from here out, you're going to get maybe worship that doesn't have chairs. So chairs would be a more Western thing, and that would be offensive to them. So there'd be no chairs in their area where they would worship. And that would certainly not go against any biblical, but just a cultural thing. So here they're calling themselves a follower of Jesus. And Muslim perception is he's kind of a Christian. A little bit closer to what they would see, but still a kind of a Christian. Now, as we get to C5, it says a community remaining within the Muslim community using local cultural forms in biblically acceptable and reinterpreted Islamic forms. There would be a Muslim follower of Jesus, Muslim meaning one who submits to God. So he's a Muslim follower of Jesus. And here he's being perceived as just a strange kind of Muslim. So we're getting closer to what would be acceptable for Muslim people. And then finally, this one is in an area where it would be sometimes maybe dangerous for them to show who they are publicly. But yet they're still working within the community and seeking out those individuals to build if you will, a proto-church. There's no visible community, and secret believers may or may not be active in religious life in the Muslim community. They're a private follower of Jesus, but the Muslim perception here is that they're seen as one of us. So they're much more easily accepted into the Muslim community. So in Romans 15:20 it says, "And so I have made it my aim to preach the gospel, not where Christ was named, lest I should build on another man's foundation." So here's Paul talking about what his true theme, his true bearing, his true identity. And so again, it might be a little hard to read the things, but that's okay. This is the Mediterranean Sea. And the lines, these are just Paul's missionary journeys. And probably most of you have the Bible with the maps in the back. And these are his journey. I just wanted to point that out. We're not going to necessarily stay very long, but I wanted to point out that this is, he traveled extensively. And he did so in order to not build on another's foundation. So Paul was a pioneer. And the definition of pioneer, now, a person who was the first to explore or settle a new country or area. So we think of pioneers in American life, but 50 years ago, there was a certain event that we celebrated this past summer, and that event was the landing on the moon. Mr. Charles F. Dietrich was employed at NASA's Johnson Space Center. He was the lead Apollo retrofire officer for most of the Apollo missions, including the first lunar landing mission, Apollo 11. He, along with 400,000, made it possible for Neil Armstrong to take the first step on the moon and proclaim, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." A definition of pioneer in the verb would be to develop or be the first to use or apply a new method, area of knowledge, or activity. In keeping with our Houston theme, in the Texas Medical Center, there was a certain nurse who interacted with a Dr. Michael E. DeBakey. I did see him in the hallway. I was a pharmacy tech, but didn't have any interaction with him. He was an American cardiovascular surgeon, educator, international medical statesman, and pioneer in surgical procedures for the treatment of defects and diseases of the cardiovascular system. That particular nurse was Miss Lori Verona, that you know as Lori McNulty, my wife. And Charles Dietrich, his last name is the same as my middle name, that is my uncle. So let's take a look at Abraham. Abraham left Ur of the Chaldees right here. So here's Israel. So he left Ur the Chaldees. This is what was called the Fertile Crescent here. I want you to just take a note of, there's Nineveh up there, which is the modern day Mosul, which obviously has been in the news quite frequently with ISIS and ISIL. Genesis 12:3. Now the Lord had said to Abram, Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So the families, nations, people groups, this is the things that we've been talking about, that through Abraham, through the people of Israel, and now through the church, all families on earth will be blessed. So we're going to briefly take a look at just the map of Exodus. As they traveled for 40 years through the desert, they had a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And for the longest time, I thought the pillar of cloud kind of went in front of them, like they were just following this pillar of cloud. Well, let's take a look at the desert. What is the desert? It's hot in the daytime, brutally hot. And at nighttime, it's really cold. So the cloud was not in front of them. The cloud was above them, which provided shade. So it provided this nice, cooling environment. So as they walked across the desert, they were in an area of shade. And all these different nations that encountered, they were like, hey, who are those people over there with a giant cloud above them? They're like, oh, that's the Israelites. That's their God taking care of them. We already know how it influenced the Egyptians as they were able to see up close and personal, firsthand, the miracles of God, which, again, God was blessing other nations, whether it was the Egyptians or the others that they came in contact with. Now, Jonah, we pretty much always just hear about the fish and that's a great, children's story. I want you to take a look at, there's obviously Joppa, where he got started, Tarshish way over here, which is pretty much commonly believed. And how long was he inside the belly of the fish? Right, 3 days, 3 nights inside the belly of the fish. So it pretty much took the fish a long, long journey. So we're not quite sure how far he was making his path over there, but at some point in time, the storm hit, they threw him overboard, and he's inside the belly of the fish, and then vomits him out. That's a very unpleasant thing. Over here near Nineveh, which I had pointed out a little earlier. So let's take a look at that. In Jonah chapter 3, it says, now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time, saying, arise, go to Nineveh, the great city, and preach to it the message that I tell you. So Jonah arose and went to Nineveh, according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was an exceedingly great city, a 3-day journey in extent. And Jonah began to enter the city on the first day's walk. He cried out and said, yet 40 days and Nineveh shall be overthrown. So the people of Nineveh believed God, proclaimed a fast, and put on sackcloth, from the greatest to the least of them. Then word came to the king of Nineveh, and he arose from his throne, laid aside his robe, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat in ashes. And he caused it to be proclaimed and published throughout Nineveh by the decree of the king and his nobles, saying, let neither man nor beast, herd nor flock, taste anything. Do not let them eat or drink water. But let man and beast be covered with sackcloth, and cry mightily to God. Yes, let every one turn from his evil ways and from the violence that is in his hands. Who can tell if God will turn and relent and turn away from his fierce anger, so that we may not perish? Then God saw their works, that they turned from their evil way, and God relented from the disaster that he said he would bring upon them, and he did not do it. So, word may have reached Nineveh about Jonah's miracle with the fish. His face would have been bleached white by the stomach acid, which gave credibility to his story and a listening ear of the Ninevites. It said that there's 120,000 that don't know their right hand from their left hand. So obviously that refers to infants and small children. So if there's 120,000 infants and small children, there may very well have been well over 1 million people in Nineveh. So can you imagine 1 million people wearing sackcloth and ashes and repenting? What a tremendous witness that was. And here we are, Jonah, obviously the reluctant, had no love for the Ninevites, didn't want to have anything to do with them, and was all ready for them to be destroyed. But yet God had other plans, and the people truly repented. Now let's take a look at something between Malachi and Matthew. Don't worry about the red arrows, but I want you to take a look at these black arrows, starting here, specifically the ones that are coming up here. This is Turkey. So from Jerusalem over here towards Greece and then up to Rome. From about 300 BC to just before Christ, there was an immigration. Not with the letter I, but with the letter E. As in they were immigrating out of Israel, the Jewish people, for whatever reason, economic, business, what have you, started immigrating out to Turkey, which was called Asia Minor back then, Greece, Italy, Rome, and then down here along in North Africa as well. Always see where it says 300 to 100 BC here, 300 to 100 BC here. So this was a period of time called Hellenistic Greece, from the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC until the rise of the Roman Empire in 31 BC. So the Jewish people were moving out into different areas. So in Acts chapter 2, verse 5, it says, "And there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven. And when this sound occurred, the multitude came together and were confused, because everyone heard them speak in his own language. Then they were all amazed and marveled, saying one to another, 'Look, are not all these who speak Galileans? How is it that we hear each in our own language in which we were born?'" Now I want you to take a look, if you can, starting on the right, as I read from verse 9. It says, then how is it that each of us hears them in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretans and Arabs. We hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongue. So here you have the Jewish people had gone all of these areas, and so these people had come during Pentecost and were there to witness and heard the language, heard them speaking in their own language. And here we have like a dozen different peoples just right here. So this is the 1040 window. And I know it's a little bit hard to see, but I just at least wanted to give you a map of the world. And I want you to take note. Take a look at where the promised land is. Right here. This is Israel. It is in the crossroads of these three major continents. If you want to get from Asia over to Africa, you've got to go through Israel. If you want to come from Europe down into Africa, staying on land. You got to go through Israel. So there was a reason that God made that the promised land, so that it was in a sense, the center that people would have to cross through as they traveled for whatever reason. Now, part of this 1040 window, I just want to read just a few of the peoples that are represented here. I have an app that gives me an unreached people group every day that allows me to pray for them, specific prayers and specific needs. In Pakistan, there's the Jinwar people who are Muslim, almost 800,000 no believers. Also in Pakistan, the Jat people, Muslim, over 600,000 no believers. The Kambo people of India, who are Sikh, 500,000 no believers. And the Hajam in Pakistan, 2.2 million no believers. So this is just a few of what I get on a daily basis. And it's heartbreaking. And so what can we do? We certainly can pray, and then we can pray specifically. We can pray that the Lord will prepare the hearts of the peoples, of these people groups, to receive the message. We can pray for laborers to be sent forth into the harvest field. We can pray for fruitful church planting in a way that they will be able to understand and not be offended by cultural trappings, but be able to truly hear the gospel in their own language in a way that they can understand. We can pray for protection for those laborers and for the new believers, both physically and spiritually. We can pray that the new believers would be instructed in God's word and immediately tell others instead of waiting for them to be trained. Go and share your joy. Spread the joy. Let them know. And pray for the leaders of these people. Because too often in the past, we've plucked one or two or three people out of a people group. And yet, if we focus on prayer for the leaders, if the leaders choose and follow Christ, then the people group will follow their leaders. And they, whether it's tribal leaders or the leaders of their group. So in conclusion, I want to share my heart and just let you know that it is my desire that as a church that we could take up that burden of praying for unreached people groups. And if the Lord lays upon your heart a burden, talk to me. I can help you to see what we can do and truly make a difference. And so that our community can, here at Katy, can truly be reached, not just across the world, but also in our own communities. This is Houston. And as I had earlier talked about Houston and the great things that the world had seen Houston do, there's great things for us here to do in God's kingdom. People have come from all over the world. If you've been here any amount of time, there is a street called Hillcroft. I grew up in a community called Sharpstown, and Hillcroft is just to the east. On the south side of Hillcroft, near Braeswood, is what we know as the Caribbean community. Jamaican, Haitian, Trinidad, all the communities of the Caribbean represented in some form or fashion down there. As you've traveled further north, up Hillcroft, another one of our many Hispanic communities there at Bel Air, but also at Bel Air is the beginning of Chinatown, or really Asiatown, because Chinese, Filipino, Vietnamese, we have street names in Chinese, street names in Vietnamese. The world has come here. As you keep going further up Hillcroft, it's a Lebanese Middle Eastern area. And so, again, this is just one street in our community with all these different villages, so to speak, all these different communities of people that have come from all over. And Houston is a city, a exceedingly great city of 4 million. And so we have the believers here. We have the believers here in our own church that have a burden for the lost of these people who have come from different lands, and they're right here with us. So in our prayers and our actions, we can keep our eyes open and allow God to lead us. And thus we can finish the task. Amen.